So last week, we went back to Bereshit in the beginning in the Torah, right? Bereshit, the beginning, and just talked about life. And in order to understand this whole process of life and death, we went back to the beginning. And then we went a little further in Bereshit to where death is actually introduced. So we talked about, I think a critical thing that we talked about was that this unified field of pure consciousness, Ein Sof, without beginning, without end, just emanating, right, to a unity. And that unity we talked about in Hebrew 13, love 13, the connection of which is 26, and that's indicative or emblematic of what this unified field of consciousness is. It's one, echad, ahava, love, one love, echad, is 26, which is the numerical value of the holy name of God, right? So we talked about how the desire, we read from the Zohar, and how the desire of that unified field was to have a field of relativity, and made space for that field of relativity, made a home with the energy of the letter Bet, which is Bait for home as well, and Bereshit for beginning. So the Zohar used the beautiful word palace. So this universe, all the universes, this palace or space, which the essence is the one unified field. But there's many palaces, and their essence is the unified field. So we are, our bodies are, nervous systems are, a palace whose essence is Ein Sof, or pure consciousness. So we talked about that, right? And we talked about in this palace, Ein Sof, for this unified field of love, pure consciousness, God, can be experienced through the vessel of the palace, of the home, of the body, of the nervous system. And we said, okay, well, let's move this forward a little bit. This is a Reader's Digest version of what we talked about. And then we talked about this garden, the Garden of Eden, a palace within a palace. And the idea of the tree of life being in the center of this garden, in the center of us, within us, this tree of life, and the supernal waters flowing within that tree through these channels that are called rivers in the Torah, right? Now, within this garden, there are other trees. And one of those trees is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And this is where death first comes into the Torah. So we talked about that. What happens? Well, what happens in the story is God creates Adam and then Eve in this garden and tells them, you can take from the trees, have a good time, enjoy, but don't take from this tree of knowledge of good and evil. Because if you do, on that day, you shall surely die. So, I don't know how many hours later, not very many. I think they were created 9 hours before that proclamation, and then within 1 hour, they had eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's the Midrash, or the oral Torah behind the Torah of just the story in Bereshit. I don't know how they come up with those times. It's beyond me, and I don't think it's important to what we're trying to glean from this story. But what is important is there's a couple of ways to look at this, right? And one is as a historical accounting of something that actually happened. And there's no way that we could know that that's true. So we don't really know if it happened or not, to be honest. Some of us believe it happened, and this is a historical accounting, and some of us don't. That's also not important. Because either way, I know for sure that we can glean from this story good things for our own personal development, our own emotional, psychological, and spiritual development into higher states of consciousness. So that's really what matters. Not so much did this happen at some point in time, more that here's a story from the Torah, an instruction that will enable us to understand life better and everything about life, including death. Right? So that's what we're looking at here. So then we said, okay, here's Adam and Eve in the garden. They're in the garden, and there's this tree of life, which the supernal waters flow freely and gives life. And then there's this tree of knowledge of good and evil that they shouldn't eat. Then along comes this serpent, convinces Eve pretty quickly that it's okay to eat the apple, or that was turned out to be a fig, according to the Midrash. And Chava, Eve, eats the apple, eats the fig, and convinces Adam to do it as well. Then all of a sudden, things change. Their consciousness shifts, and they discover that they're naked, and they hide behind trees. And God comes along and he says, why are you hiding? We're hiding because we're naked. How do you know you're naked? And obviously it comes out that they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Adam says, she did it, gave it to me. And she says, the serpent gave it to me. And I don't know who to blame. And I don't think that's important either, right? So then we looked at that and said, okay, what was an immediate consequence of this eating of the fig from the tree of knowledge of good and evil? They obviously were ashamed that they were naked. That's the first thing that happens that we read, right? So we talked about that. Why were they ashamed? And what is that about? And then we came up with a bunch of great ideas, and we talked about self-awareness, and we talked about judgment, and we talked about illusion, and all these things are good and pre-recorded, so we can go back and listen. Just wanted to add a few little things that might be pertinent to our discussions about this. They're mainly theosophical in the tradition. We just wanted to add them so that it would be a better, sort of fuller picture of where these sages are coming from, right? So the idea here is that God breathed life into Adam and Eve. He breathed a soul into them. And the idea is that creation, on one end being unified field, pure consciousness, love, Ein Sof, and on the other end, the grossest relative existence that we live on, has all levels to it. So once you come out of the absolute and into the relative, there are multiple levels. So it's diverse, it's dynamic. There's a lot of diversity in it, which is different than the absolute, right? Which is one. I bring this up because the general pervading theory of Kabbalists and mystics in the Semitic tradition is that the soul of Adam and Eve, before their creation in the Garden of Eden, existed in another sphere or level of the relative. And it was understood that they accepted the task of uplifting the lowest sphere of the relative. Okay? So before they became Adam and Eve, these souls accepted this thing that they would be uplifting the lowest sphere. Very theosophical. No way we could know this to be true or not true. But the point here is, when they became Adam and Eve in this garden, they were not in the lowest sphere of the relative. It was a pretty good, highly evolved sphere. The tree of life is there, and they're experiencing life as being, right? For that hour. God says, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They do it. He says you will surely die on that day. They do it, and they don't die on that day, physically. And he adds to the deal. So God breaks the deal right from the get-go. Now you're going to suffer. You're going to suffer in your labor to make a living. You're going to suffer in giving birth. That wasn't part of the original deal, right? God didn't say to Chava and Adam, you're going to suffer in this way. He just said, you will surely die. So what's going on here? What's going on is that, according to the sages, in order for the intended purpose, which was accepted by these souls, they had to go down some levels in the relative sphere from the garden, right? So if you think of the absolute pure love consciousness, and then you think of it becoming relative and going through diverse stages of relativity till it gets to the lowest stage, in order for them to uplift and enlighten the lowest stage, they had to be in the lowest stage, which they were not in their original form. Which means, I'm not making this up, so you can probably find this in other Kabbalistic books and videos and whatever somewhere. So as I was taught this, it turns out that this was actually not as we would think of a sin. So God didn't come, find them, and start yelling at them and thunder and cursing them. It was more like, wow, you did it. You had accepted this, and you actually crossed the border into a lower sphere of consciousness. So when I'm teaching over the years, you've all heard me say that when we reach higher states of consciousness, the Sefer Yetzirah claims that there are 32 states of consciousness. We're all on one of them, right? Maybe the highest, maybe the lowest, maybe in the middle. We're growing, but we come to a border. Abba Lucia uses the word border. And we have to decide to cross it. I've said this a million times. You can meditate, dive deep within, and allow the klipot to disappear. But when you come into the world of action, if your intention is not to cross the border, you won't. You have to have a desire to cross the border to a higher consciousness. It's not meditation is just magic. If you want to improve, if you want to improve spiritually in a greater union, a more perfect union, you have to desire it, right? So the point here is these souls agreed to go the opposite way. So each time we cross a border, it's like being born from above. The terminology is being born anew, being born from above, right? You cross this border into a higher consciousness. You can go the opposite way, as Adam and Eve did in the garden. So Adam and Eve in the garden ate from the tree of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. They were in a higher being consciousness for the purpose of desiring to uplift not only themselves, but other souls in a lower state of consciousness. They did that. That's the midrash, the oral description of what happened. So it wasn't like it was A, not expected, that God somehow didn't know what was going to happen, B, that it was a terrible thing, no, it was part of a plan. So why is this important to our discussion? Well, it's important from the point of view of if we're going to learn, if we're going to grow, and if we're going to be less afraid of suffering and death, we need to be willing to cross some borders. And we can learn from these stories what that means and how it shows up in the world of creation, formation, and action. So we still look at the story like we did last time and say, what really happened? What is this tree? Now, let me also point out, the tree is not the tree of knowledge, which is often just given that term. It's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So you understand the difference? Like knowledge is one thing. Knowledge of good and evil clearly is a judgment. It introduces a judgment. So how come they didn't die on that day? Or did they? They died and were reborn. But in their case, at the lowest level, according to the sages, so that they would then go through the process of desiring, not just for them, but for other souls, the higher consciousness. And the whole pathway, the whole plan is put in motion. Does that make sense? So when we die, at our borderlines, hopefully, we're dying to go into higher consciousness, to move on into a higher consciousness. Now, we could die many times in one physical body, and then there comes time where that body will pass as well, and will move into another state of relative consciousness, right? And that's what this discussion, as we go on and on, we'll see that more and more showing up in the tradition, in the teaching. So when God said, you will surely die on that day, he was talking about the death to the level of consciousness they were at, those souls, to another different level. In this case, the sages tell us the lowest level.
So in the simple Hebrew language,
Mhm.
Light is Aleph Vav Resh. And flesh or skin is Ayin Vav Resh. They have the same sound, but the Ayin is a descent from the Aleph. So the Ayin or becomes our flesh. So the light body transcends to a physical body. And that's the descent, which we then have the chance in this life to try and activate the Aleph energy to raise ourselves up, even while we're still incorporated in this body.
Right.
Meditation allows us to touch that experience before we actually die. Hopefully to bring more light back in, the light that we lost at the quotes fall.
Thank you. Perfect. Perfectly. Anybody else?
One of the things that happened by that descent was that it opened up the opportunity for mankind going forward to always now have free will, which I don't think was a piece of the puzzle, because prior to the fall, anything they did was perfection. So it required the fall in order to just allow for choice, which then created a completely different life walk and experience, because now we were kind of leading the way.
Yeah, so free will is definitely a piece of this theosophical thing that always is puzzling, right? The best statement I like on free will is we have to believe in it because we have no choice. So, you know, at that point, we're saying, okay, the whole point of the exercise and of the description of the exercise in Bereshit is that they chose, and by choosing to even do chet is often described as sin in Hebrew, but it really means to go lower, to like do a lower level, right? And that's really what in the Sefer Yetzirah, there's not much about good and evil except for it's a dimension. And as I was taught, good and evil is really about that which awakens you to the tree of life within yourself, that flow of supernal waters of pure consciousness is good. And that which endarkens you to that tree within yourself and those supernal waters is evil. So I was given this book that I recommend. It's by Erich Fromm.
Art of Love.
To Have or to Be. And he talks specifically about the Old and New Testaments and theories and so on, but he gets down to sort of the core issue. So the serpent, if he exists, and really as we're going forward, we're going to sort of move out of theosophical, we're in like deep theosophical waters. And there are a lot of different opinions about this going down a level or falling, or sometimes called original sin and all of that, and free will and not free will. Our goal here isn't to like unpack all of that. Our goal is to look at it and say, how does it relate to the way we think and feel and act about life and death, right? So in this story, the serpent comes to Eve and makes her some promises, right? And at the core of all of these things is the desire to have over the desire of just being, right? Again, now I think we're now going into a realm of philosophy and psychology a little bit. This guy, Erich Fromm, is both a philosopher, a psychologist, a Holocaust survivor, a genius, and all of those things, in my opinion. He's got a lot of books, but this is definitely worth reading on this topic. So I mean, on the surface, the serpent says, hey, why not eat from this tree? You'll have these things. You'll be like God. You'll have everything that God has. Right? So there, in the getting fed from the tree of life is being at its core. It's being in the moment, its existence, and it's like pure love, right? Not ashamed. There was no shame. They were naked. They didn't even know they were naked. Then they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil with the temptation of you shall have. Begins a process of wanting having more than being on this lowest level. So that struggle itself is a core struggle of the spiritual circuitous paths we are on, netiva, right? And I can tell you from a very practical standpoint, being a meditation teacher for decades, it's a core issue for folks to actually practice meditation. Because the desire to have, not just the obvious stuff, like I want to be a successful hedge fund guy and have $1 billion, you know? Okay, that takes a lot of work and that takes a lot of stress and strain, and that's a more obvious example. But the need to have, to possess, to be the God of, the owner of, right, things, isn't just things, it's also knowledge, right? There's a whole host of things. And those things draw us away from drilling, because when we're drilling, we're going into what I call the well of being. That's another book I want to recommend in a minute. The well of being, if we think we can do that vis-a-vis the intellect, vis-a-vis knowledge, we're wrong. Because when we meditate, what's the first thing I tell you? Don't judge your meditation. Don't force in and out thoughts. Just be a witness. Whatever happens, happens. Don't have a goal of no thoughts. Have I not said all those things? I've said all those things, right? So the state of meditation is the state of being. I'm saying sit and be. Use your breath, use your Hebrew letter, and the mind will take its own course diving in without your judgment. Don't tell me I had too many thoughts. I don't want to hear it. There's only one judgment. Did you try too hard? Are you making an effort? Are you forcing a goal? I want to use my letter more. I want to have less thoughts. Those are the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We're not judging at all. We're not being rigid and we're not judging, which the Zohar tells us is really the core essence of that which keeps us from experiencing higher consciousness. Not only that, people who don't meditate regularly, the reason is always I want to have rather than I want to be. If you really examine it for yourself, oh, I don't have the time. My life is chaotic right now. Really? We don't have the time for 10 minutes, 15 minutes to meditate? No, it's because there's this desire to have something. Maybe it's to have a job, or maybe it's to have something simpler like the newspaper, and we have to walk to town to get the newspaper. These to have or to be is a big thing. And I want to tell you, it's not a zero-sum game. because we do have to have things. The question is, where is our desire? Where is our priority, right? We have to have knowledge. We even have to have a judgmental knowledge. So this is why I asked you to go to Kohelet, right? So Kohelet is Ecclesiastes. So I said, if you get a chance, ponder Ecclesiastes. Because the story of Ecclesiastes, I'll just make it really simple, because this is getting way longer than you used to. And I know our attention spans are very limited in these days of technology. Kohelet is allegedly written by King Solomon, descendant of King David, right? So Kohelet was sort of a title for him. What doesn't mean his name, it really means like gathering or congregation. But he gathered people a lot, so he was kind of given the title of Kohelet, right? In Kings, it is said that God came to him and said, what do you want? Anything you want, I'll give you. And he said, what do I want? I want Chachma, wisdom. That's different than Binah, or understanding, right? Or knowledge. Those things come along. So he said, I'm going to have to rule by your decree the people of Israel. So I'm going to have to make judgments. So we're talking about here. The king has to make judgments. One of you come and say, hey, I own this piece of property. And the other one comes and says, no, I own this piece of property. And as the king, I have to decide who's this property. What he's asking for is wisdom, chachma, consciousness, which means in every Kabbalistic, whether it's Lurianic Kabbalism or Ablafian Kabbalism, what chachma is experiential wisdom. It's experiencing the supernal waters within. That's the wisdom. It's not listening to somebody speak like I've been speaking endlessly here. It's not reading a book. It's not studying a lesson from 20 years ago. It's experiencing the waters of the supernal tree of life within ourselves. That's what Chachma is. So Solomon said, that's what I want, so that I can make these judgments from there. In fact, in Kohelet itself, it actually says that. It says, I, Kohelet, king over Israel and Jerusalem, I applied my mind to seek and probe by Chachma all that happens beneath the sky. So he's seeking all that happens beneath the sky through Chachma, which is wisdom, which is experience of the supernal waters. So that's why it's critical that that be primary. When I say primary, I mean primordial to us. That state of being, not a state of high intellect. There's nothing wrong with being smart and having a lot of knowledge. That's not the point. In this book that I recommended to you, I want to read a paragraph from it. This lesson is way longer than usual, but I ask for your patience. When we say a man ought to be empty of his own knowledge, it does not mean that one should forget what one knows, but rather one should forget that one knows. Okay, there's a difference. This is to say that we should not look at our knowledge as a possession in which we find security and which gives us a sense of identity, We should not be filled with our knowledge or hang on to it or crave it. Knowledge should not assume the quality of a dogma which enslaves us. All this belongs to the mode of having. In the mode of being, knowledge is nothing but the penetrating activity of thought, without ever becoming an invitation to stand still in order to find certainty. This is a gift. That paragraph to me was really life-changing. And then last but not least, so going back to Kohelet, Solomon says, for futility of futilities, everything is futile. And he goes through all of existence in the world of creation and action and formation, and says none of it, it's all futile. Whether you're good or you're bad, whether you're rich or poor, it all comes to an end and it's all futility. He's explaining why the fruits of the tree of judgment or knowledge of good and evil and everything that surrounds it, the illusion that Sarah mentioned in our last meeting is that there is an end of peace in the world of having an activity. No, there isn't. What ultimately you come to is within the palace is the essence. You don't have to burn down the palace. There's nothing wrong with your palace, nothing wrong with having a palace. In the palace of the relative sphere of creation, which is the home of the essence of pure love, pure God consciousness, the supernal waters, that's where they exist. So the palace is a means of experiencing that. But if you're worshiping the palace or trying to control it or have it, you are not in a state of being. You can't be here now. You're not in a state of the moment. So this book is the last thing I'm going to talk about. It's called The Well of Being. So we're well drillers. My daughter Tamar found this book in some bookstore in Maine. And I think it sums up teaching that I've been doing for 40 years. And it's mostly drawings. The author is Jean-Pierre Wheel. He's a French-Canadian Jew. Not that that matters. But this is the book. I highly recommend it. Very easy to read. It's mostly pictures. But I want to read one quick section to pull all this stuff we've been talking about together before we meditate. Once upon a time, when we were infants in the garden, with no thought to be anything other than ourselves, we lived in the sanctuary of one, Echad, without even knowing it. Oh, that's so beautiful. There was neither good or bad, nor right or wrong. The world was whole. There's cool little drawings of this, but I'll spare you. Whatever we made was a masterpiece. And it shows a little kid drawing pictures and stuff. One day that child that was us passed an empty wall. A picture would be splendid here. He shows the child drawing pictures on the wall. 5 trees, 4 birds, 3 stars, 2 deer, 1 moon. The wall looks really beautiful. Then footsteps. A wonderful surprise is coming, he thought. Oh, what a discovery. So the picture is mommy is not too happy. that the wall is now have drawings all over it. I guess mothers could relate to that. But it was he who had made the discovery. The discovery now was he could do something wrong. That he or the world could be wrong, and that he was alone. From then on, he practiced ways to rearrange himself, to make himself acceptable. When I first started engaging in some of this discussion, and I was first given this book by Eric Fromm, I have to say that just it didn't sit well with me for a lot of reasons. But after I examined my reasons and after I looked more deeply into it, it really all started making sense. So I'm saying that that's something that we need to do. And I'm not saying you have to accept any of this. It's just something that you need to look more deeply into rather than just not say, oh, I don't buy that, or I heard something different or something like that. It needs to be pondered. But next week, I'd like to get a little more deeper into this idea that Eric Fromm presents, to have or to be. You don't have to read the book. It would be great if you did, but it's probably available online. But I would like to talk more about that because, as I said, it's not a zero-sum game. We obviously need to have in order to be, right? So it's worthy of a deeper discussion. And one more thing quickly, my teacher never gave me a book that he expected me to accept everything in or believe that the author was perfect in any way, shape, or form. Okay? In fact, I've been given books by him who he thought there was only one good thing in the whole book. So I'm not recommending his book saying, I never met this guy. So, I mean, it's not an endorsement of, I just think the book really has a lot of valuable ideas relating to the story of Adam and Eve and to have or to be in life and death.